a lot of content. So if people are ready, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I'd like this session to be interactive. So when I ask for input, please feel free to offer your input. I don't know if any of you know who Zen Master Thich Nhat Hahn was. Does that ring any bells with the group at all?
No.
Well, Thich Nhat Hahn was a global spiritual leader. He was a poet. He was a peace activist. He was renowned for his powerful teachings and a lot of his best-selling writings on mindfulness and peace. He was a gentle, humble monk who Dr. Martin Luther King called an apostle of peace and nonviolence when he nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a Vietnamese monk. He was exiled from Vietnam for almost 4 decades, much like the Dalai Lama, who has been, for his peaceful protests and peaceful activism in Nepal was exiled. And he set up in France a Sangha. A Sangha is a community in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And he set up a community called Plum Village. And he became a pioneer in actually bringing Buddhism and mindfulness to the West. And in his community continues to thrive, even though he has passed on. He was 95 years old. He had, about 3 years ago, he had a stroke and kind of went into seclusion for some time. And then just recently in the last year or so, started doing more teachings. And in the last few months of his life, they actually took him back to Vietnam to his original monastery, and he actually passed away in Vietnam. So that's kind of the background on it. The teaching No Mud, No Lotus, I learned from, or really first heard of, was from one of my fellow spiritual care people up at Hazel and Betty Ford when I was teaching and working in the spiritual care area at the Renewal Center there. And her name was Delia Jurek, and Delia is an artist. She lives up in Chisago, and she would teach it on a whiteboard. And so I've kind of tried to put a drawing together. It's not very good because I'm not the artist that Delia is, but it's kind of an interesting teaching about how we move from the mud at the bottom of the pond to the lotus blossom at the top. Thich Nhat Hahn said, the main affliction of our modern civilization is that we don't know how to handle suffering inside us. And we try to cover it up with all kinds of consumption. I'll let that sink in there for a minute. If we don't know how to handle our pain, as I always say, untransformed pain becomes transmitted pain. Things that we don't transform inside ourselves, we transmit to others. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about, what kind of sufferings do we have in our lives, and what does it mean to be happy? Being happy doesn't mean that there is no suffering. As Thich Nhat Hahn said in his book, No Mud, No Lotus. And that book is available, through Amazon or actually through the library, I think, as well. The first part of the book is kind of his teachings on suffering and transforming suffering and happiness and how those go hand in hand as both sides of a paper. You have the front and the back of a paper. They're opposite sides, but they're actually one and the same. And he talks about suffering and happiness being 2 different sides of the same element, but they are one and the same. And how do we transform the suffering on one side into the happiness on the other? He talks about the art of happiness is also the art of suffering well. To be happy, it's critical that we embrace and manage our suffering. So suffering is hard, even if we can accept it. None of us like to suffer, but it's also where our biggest lessons come from. Suffering is part of the human condition, and we have to realize that it's okay not to be okay sometimes. If we get sick or lose someone we love, of course, we'll suffer. But as we sit with those feelings, as he says, sitting in the mud, what we realize is that over time, the lotus starts to grow and bloom. So it's often our deepest scars that can lead then to our biggest gifts. It's a new book that came out this past week, I think it was. And it's called The Power of Regret. It's written by Dan Pink. I just started reading it. But his concept in that book is that what we regret the most in our life is what we desire the most. So our deepest regrets are also have a different side. If we take our regrets and turn them around, what is our deepest desire? And if you know a little bit about the symbolism of the lotus flower in the Buddhist tradition, the lotus is rooted in the mud and it's nourished by the mud, and it blossoms then into a beautiful flower that in Buddhism and some of the other Eastern religions symbolizes the awakening of the heart and mind. And so the foundation of this teaching is that the mud acts as nutrients for the lotus. And we all have difficulties and suffering in our lives, but if we're awakened and present to our suffering, we're provided with the nourishment that we need to grow and blossom. So today, that'll kind of be our exploration of no mud, no lotus. So this is, try to get this up here. This is my drawing. Oh, I got it. I can't. You guys can't see it because it keeps turning into something else. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can change that. I'm going to turn off my filter here. There. Now I'm back. I'm out of the monastery and into my bedroom. So I'm going to move this over here. I'm going to pull it back, and this is really hard to do. Okay, now you can kind of see it. Let me turn it. I'm going to cover my face. So down here at the bottom of this pond, we have the mud. And as you see, the lotus, as it starts to grow, it comes up and it forms this long stem that then comes to the top of the water here. And that's supposed to be a lotus. And if I move it over, you've got the sun, the clouds, and the sun over on this side. It's all backwards to me. This is really hard. So keeping that kind of in mind and thinking about it, using that illustration, what kinds of things could you say? What is your mud? The best thing about being able to transform our suffering is to be able to name our suffering. So can you think of some terms or something that hits home for you that would be kind of your mud? Yeah. Can you get into the elements of that? Say, like, actually getting down to the elements of maybe fear or grief or anger in that as well. Anyone else have something to offer? Definitely physical pain. We talk about suffering, but suffering comes in many different elements. It can be It can be physical, it can be mental, it can be emotional, and it can be spiritual. As most of you know, I'm in a program of recovery myself. Have been for the last 15 years, and one of the things that we do in our program is on a daily basis we take a kind of an inventory of ourselves and see where we are, and there are 4 elements that we always look for in our suffering for the day, and those are selfishness, dishonesty, fear, and resentment. And as I always say, resentment is actually just a result of our own expectations, where we've expected something of someone else and it hasn't occurred, and oftentimes we hold a resentment because of it. But along with that, we also have that anger and grief and regret. And so, as Thich Nhat Hahn teaches, this is part of that transformation. Is how do we transform that into, use those nutrients, use those things that we learn from our suffering in order to transform it into some form of happiness for us. Many of us might remember the story of Jonah and being in the belly of the whale, and how he tried to run from suffering and still ended up in the belly of the whale. And I don't think there's any of us that hasn't spent some time in the mud or the dark belly of the sea beast. I don't care how intelligent, lucky, or stupid human we think we are. We still are only flesh and bone. And if we've lived on this planet long enough, or dared to invest our heart in someone or something other than ourselves, we will experience that pain of suffering. And yet, none of us are jumping up to sign up for the dark night of the soul, as John would say. And yet, when we learn from that and transform that suffering, it often happens in that darkness. It happens in our stillness. It happens in our meditation practice, and that we try to stay mindful and in the present. And that's really what Thich Nhat Hahn is teaching in this, is that how do we, through our meditation practices, be able to identify first, and transform our suffering into our own happiness. We also can remember the story in the Bible where a man was born blind, and he was healed by Jesus. And oddly, Jesus spits and uses the mud to anoint the man's eyes so that he can see for the first time. And that's kind of what this teaching helps us do, is use the mud of our pain and suffering to be awakened and see for the first time. In that area that I showed you on my illustration, that long stem that comes up through the water to reveal the lotus blossom that sits on the top, I kind of look at that as being the environment that we're growing through, whether that be the physical environment, mental environment, emotional, what I call emotional maturity, and spiritual environment. Those things that surround us and that buoy us up, allow us to take the nutrients that we need from the soil and actually blossom into the lotus flower. One of the elements on that you notice is that the stem for the lotus is not directly from the mud to the top of the water. it's often got a long curl to it because the water is not always calm. And when the water is riled, it goes up and down. And so if the lotus were on a smaller or a straight stem and it didn't have any flexibility to it, it would soon break the flower off of the stem. And so I think of that in terms of how our life and our environment can surround us and allow us to be buoyed up when we might have a short stem. So, any thoughts or comments? And you bring out a good point in that there are other forms of suffering rather than just personal suffering. We have generational suffering. We think about many of our immigrants and minorities. We have we have our native population who carries generational suffering. Our people of color who carry generational suffering. And then there's communal suffering as well. As you kind of mentioned, you are in grief not only just for yourself, for your son-in-law, but those of his family who also loved him. And that is what we know is the power of our congregation, the power of congregational worship and prayer is often taught in the Buddhist tradition, in the philosophy of the Buddhist, in the Sangha, which is the community. Just as we are a faith community, a Sangha is a community of faith, people of faith in the Buddhist tradition as well. So as we grow, then we have that long stem that brings us to that beautiful blossom that sits on the top of the water to see the beautiful sun. And part of that transformation is being able to imagine or envision what our blossom would look like. Can we see and accept who we are today without judgment of who we or others think we should be? And I think that's a big element of this transformation is being ourselves, allowing ourselves to be who we are without having outside influence and telling us how we should be or how we should react. Does anybody know T. Michael Rambo? He's an actor in the local area. He's also in recovery, and T. Michael Rambo was told by his grandmother as he was growing up, just to be you, and always be you till full. So he reminds us to be you to full. Be you always, and you will be beautiful. So now I'd like to do a practice. It's a guided meditation that will hopefully help us understand a little bit about finding our suffering through our prayer and meditation, being able to sit with that suffering, identify it specifically, naming it, and allowing it to be, welcoming it, and allowing it to be transformed. So if you would find a place where you're seated comfortably, and Thich Nhat Hahn always starts his meditations out with noticing our breath. So begin to notice your breathing. And if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes or just have a downward gaze. Be steady in your breathing. Allow it to be and note as it gently moves in and out of your body. Notice how your breathing naturally occurs, and allow yourself to feel gratitude for your breath. Your unconsciousness knows exactly how to keep you alive, and does so just like that with your breathing. Keep your awareness with each in-breath and your out-breath. Be present right now with your in-breath and your out-breath, right in this very moment. Acknowledge what you feel in your heart at this moment. If there is suffering, recognize it and greet it with compassion. Say, welcome, I see you, and I'm here for you. Try to bring to mind exactly what this suffering is related to in your daily life. It may be a doubt or a burden, a regret, sometimes simply anger at how difficult some things are in life. Don't be afraid to welcome your suffering. But as you bring to mind an episode in which you suffered most recently, stay in your body. Stay in the present. Stay in your breath and let it anchor you. Steady your calm and your breathing. Notice what happens when you imagine that suffering and really allow yourself to feel it. Notice what may be happening with your breath and bring it back to a gentle in-breath and gentle out-breath until you notice your body becoming even more steady and still as you sit. As your mind or heart feels the hurt of that suffering, stay present with it in your compassion for that suffering place inside of you. Where you see, when we try to resist suffering, it only tangles us up in a knot of resistance to life, just as it is. And from there, it's so easy to fall into regret or apprehension or guilt about the past or anxiety about the future. And then what happens to the moment of the present? It disappears. And yet, that is where we are. So in this practice, we learn to sit with suffering and bring back into our mind the place that we visited, where you may suffer and allow yourself to be aware. Where in your body you feel suffering the most, just let it reveal itself as a tightness, constriction, or agitation. Wherever you feel suffering, you may feel it in the front part of your chest or your throat, or may feel your breath getting shallower. You may want to move or distract yourself with something, but return to the steadiness of the gift of breathing gently. Take a full in-breath and full out breath as you try to hold that suffering with compassion. Much of our suffering has to do with uncertainty and with a certain kind of brokenheartedness. Ask the suffering to show you so you know where it lives. Our body is always in the present. It can't be anywhere else but the present. And so breathing mindfully in our bodies brings us to the present and brings us with practice to steadiness. So as we come to the close of this meditation journey, welcome suffering. Ask your suffering to teach you what you need to know in order to grow. While you do, keep your awareness when you're breathing. As you breathe, feel a release into the present. Imagine, if you will, the long stem of the lotus as it spirals up from the mud through the water. And see in your mind's eye the opening of the lotus flower at the surface of the water. And feel the warmth of the sunlight on your face. Your beauty is rooted in the mud of life, but shines ever forth in the blossom you truly are. Continue to observe your breathing as you take your breath in and release your breath out. You can begin to bring your attention back to this space, to this time, to this place, and join in community again. Any feedback from the group? All right. Well, you all have a blessed day, as they say down here in the South. You all have a great day, and we'll see you. I think we have another PrayerLab session in 2 weeks. So